Hey astrology fans, how you doing? It's Maechyl here, ready to talk to you today about something that is it's actually quite rare. It's something that the United States is right on the cusp of achieving. A little milestone here. You've seen the title by now. I am talking about the Pluto return of the United States of America. So in this video, we're going to talk about what exactly a Pluto return is, what it means, what it implies, past examples of other countries that have gone through their Pluto return, and loads more stuff. So let's do it. So first of all, Pluto return. What the hell are you talking about, Maechyl? So obviously we live in a solar system that's in constant motion. The sun's at the center, and then you've got all the other planets constantly orbiting around it. In astrology, we use a geocentric model for the solar system, which is to say we put the Earth at the center because everything's from the perspective of Earth, which is why, of course, the sun appears to move from our perspective, and therefore in a chart, astrological chart, it appears to move around. So what you really do when you drop a natal chart for a person, for an event, for a country, like in this case, what you're really doing is you're taking a snapshot of the alignment of all these celestial objects. And what you really are able to get some insight into is the quality of that moment. But of course, all these planets continue to move. They continue to orbit around. So what we can do is we call those planets that are still moving, we call them transit planets in astrology. So you can superimpose the transits on a chart and get more insight that way. And of course, because they effectively move in a circle through all the zodiac signs, it's inevitable that eventually each planet will return in transit to the same spot that it is on a natal chart. And when that happens, we call that a return. The most obvious of these returns is your solar return, which is also known as your birthday. We even say many happy returns, don't we? And I'm not 100% sure, but I strongly suspect that is an astrological expression, because that is your solar return. It's when the sun returns, because of course 360 degrees are in the zodiac, 365 days in the year. It's almost exactly 1 degree per day. So the sun comes around, that's your solar return. Another one people generally know about, I think, is probably your Saturn return, where Saturn comes all the way around and comes back to its position, to its natal position in your chart. That's called your Saturn return. And Saturn returns are they're seen as kind of a bogeyman, I think, probably second only to the Mercury retrograde. People like to blame a lot of their problems on the Saturn return. So Saturn solar return takes 1 year. Saturn return takes 28, 29, 30 years, depending exactly on the orbit, etc. So as we get further out in the solar system, these returns take longer and longer. Uranus return, if you live to 84, you will get your Uranus return. Congratulations. If it's your life goal to live to see your Neptune return, then all I can say is I hope you're eating plenty of vegetables and getting plenty of rest, because you're going to have to live until you're 165 years old. People don't get their Neptune return. People just don't live that long. Pluto returns, of course, take even longer. We're talking 248 years. You'd only get 4 of these every millennium. People obviously don't get their Pluto return. A lot of countries, as we'll discuss in a minute, a lot of countries don't even live long enough to see their Pluto return. So what hope of individual people got to get this? You're not going to see that. So we're talking about something that happens over a long period of time. And because the further they go out in the solar system, of course, their orbit is longer. These outer planets move a lot more slowly. This transit, the Pluto return, is much more like a process than it is an event. It's something that the effects of which are being able to be felt. The effects will be felt over the course of several years. I've seen some astrologers refer to a Saturn return as like taking a test. It's an opportunity to take a test and then get the results of that test. And with a Saturn return, of course, that is relevant to issues that are related to Saturn. So obviously, we're talking about maturity, we're talking about discipline, things like that, growing up, essentially. So with a Pluto return, it's going to be roughly the same thing, except it's going to be relating to issues that are to do with Pluto. So I'm talking about issues around power, the process of disintegration, which is then followed by rebirth, and also exposing shadows, things that were not previously conscious or visible, beings, a bit of light being shown on them, and then them being a bit easier to see. So Pluto return is like a test of what skeletons you've got in the closet, kind of your dirty laundry getting aired a little bit. So basically the primary question here for the USA that's being posed by its Pluto return is, has the USA since its inception made the best use of its natal chart? Alright, so I want to discuss a couple of historic examples of countries that have gone through a Pluto return. A little point before that, it becomes a little bit muddy when you start to consider, when you want to consider the question of when is a country the same and at what point is it a new entity that requires like a new natal chart. As an example, let's look at Russia. So if I said to you, how long has Russia been a country? You'd say, I don't know, like 1,000 years. But the Russian Federation, which is what we've got now, only actually began in 1991. Before then, it formed part of the USSR, which was there from 1917 until 1991. Before then, there was the Russian Empire, which dated back to, I don't know. So you would say, well, if you're going to do a natal chart for Russia, would you do it 1991? Would you do it from the start of the Russian Empire? But because these were different entities, I think really what you have to do, you have to make a call. You have to make a call about when a country was really born. And I'm bringing this up because this is going to be relevant for the examples that I'm giving here, but also for the USA, because for example, I'm going to use, spoiler, I'm going to use the 4th of July 1776 because that was a Declaration of Independence, and that was therefore, I think even in the USA you guys celebrate the 4th of July as like the birthday of the USA, right? But for example, if you're in a state that wasn't part of the USA from the beginning, let's say you're in Texas, then maybe you'd say, well, what about me? That's not the Texas birthday because the relevant in the context of the USA because it wasn't a part of that. So maybe you would say that every time that there's a major change in territory or things like that, then you would draw up a new natal chart. I don't know, but as I say, you have to make a call. So I'm gonna just give the 4th of July 1776 as the USA's chart. I just think it's interesting to mention. And also it's important to note that most countries basically fall apart. As I mentioned, that most countries don't even get to their Pluto return. A lot of countries either collapse or they significantly change within 250 years. So most countries don't make it to their Pluto return, never mind make it through their Pluto return. Okay, first historical example I'm going to go with is the Roman Empire. So the date I'm going to go with for the start date is 27 BC. And as far as I know, that's when the Roman Empire really began in earnest. So if we take that start date, 27 BC, as the start date for the Roman Empire, that means that their first Pluto return was ongoing during 216 to 223 AD. Now, this was an interesting time because this was marked by the hegemony of the Roman Empire was starting to create so much abundance that it started to fall into the pitfalls of its own success. They had this emperor at the time whose name was Elagabalus. I'm not great with the Latin pronunciation. So this guy basically had no respect for the societal and sexual taboos of the time, which is very Plutonian. Very interesting that he was the emperor. Again, he was the one wielding all the power. Has to do with Pluto. Now, there's a story about this guy. He held a banquet for his friends as well as for his enemies, and he wanted to show off the extravagant wealth and power and abundance that the Roman Empire was generating and was enjoying. So for the centerpiece for this banquet, he had a false ceiling put on top of in the banquet hall, and on top of that false ceiling he had just like thousands and thousands of rose petals, and the idea was he was going to have the roof open and all the dinner guests would be covered in all these petals, and they'd all be, wow, isn't it amazing, we've got all this great stuff. But actually there were far too many, and I don't believe it's clear whether or not he intended to do this or not, but actually a lot of people died. A lot of people were smothered to death and I think that's just a really good analogy for the whole situation of the Roman Empire. As they were going through their Pluto return, they just had so much that it was starting to smother them. Indeed, the size of the empire was massive. It covered just a huge degree. I actually don't have the exact number, but a huge amount of the known world at the time. In fact, it was so big that, again, the excess in terms of the physical excess, in terms of their land that they had, was so great that actually caused the empire to split in 286 AD. It became there was still the Western Empire and the Eastern Empire, which even we kind of we consider to be its own thing. We call that the Byzantine Empire. Had a different capital in Constantinople, and it was it became its own thing. So that would be an example of, you would probably drop on that date, you'd probably drop a natal chart for the Byzantine Empire, even though it previously would have been part of the Roman Empire. Remarkably, despite what I said earlier about most countries don't make it to one Pluto return, the Roman Empire, specifically now we're talking about the Western Roman Empire, actually did survive to see a second Pluto return. Now this happened between 461 to 468 AD, and this is when the Western Empire really started to fall apart. It was getting sacked and raided and so on by the Huns and the Vandals and so on, and it was really starting to crumble, really starting to show its age. And the Western Roman Empire was formally abolished by Emperor Zeno in 480 AD. So that is less than 20 years after its second Pluto return. The second historical example I'm going to bring up is that of Great Britain. Now, this also is a bit of an asterisk, a bit controversial. A lot of astrologers who discuss Pluto returns, they give the example of England, and they take 1066 as the birthday of England. That's generally considered to be after the Battle of Hastings, I believe, was when England became England, essentially. I would say that, maybe it's just because I'm Scottish, that that's not a fair birth date, because if you want to then talk about the British Empire and so on, because England doesn't exist anymore as a singular political entity, and neither does Scotland, because right now what we have is the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. So although this is also not an exact fit, I'm going to go with 1707, which was the Act of Union, which merged, which basically brought Scotland in together to a political union with England and Wales. Now what's interesting is that because this was a legal document, we can have an exact date, which means we can have an exact date of the Pluto return. And that date is the 25th of July 1952. Now remember that I mentioned that these things are not actually events, but it's still interesting. I'm saying everything one way than the other. That this was an event. So let's look at what was happening in 1952. Well, would you believe it? George VI died in 1952, and of course his successor was Queen Elizabeth. Now George VI was a popular king. He was the king during World War II, so of course all the propaganda that was produced at the time, the idea instilling in the hearts of the soldiers and the minds of the soldiers, a big part of what they were fighting for was represented by the king, by this King George. And of course after winning the Second World War, he would have been seen as a real figure of strength for the British people. But his daughter came in as a very young queen, and now, honestly, if I said to you, picture the Queen, if I just say the Queen, that's what you think about it. I think it probably doesn't matter. Maybe that's just in fact, almost definitely is just my Anglo-centric point of view. But the point is that she's smashed the record for longest reign of any monarch in history. And as I'm recording this yesterday, I think was 70 years to the day that she's been queen. That's no one's coming anywhere near. So her reign begins in a time of Pluto return. So this, as we were speaking about, part of what the test presented by a Pluto return is the process of disintegration followed by a process of rebirth. So in her reign, Elizabeth has seen a lot of shit, and actually a lot of what she's seen has been the breakup and the kind of falling apart of the empire that she inherited. And not that necessarily that's her fault, it's just that the world has been moving on in that time. So in 1956 we had what was known as the Suez Crisis, which really kind of solidified that Great Britain, that the time of the British Empire as being the top dog, was over. It was definitely at the big table, let's say, but it was no longer number one. Now it's interesting, that was in 1956, and actually here's a stat for you. In 1920, 24% of all the land area on Earth was part of the British Empire. So we're talking in one generation, we're talking in 35 years, goes from being the undisputed top dog in world politics to being not that, to falling down a rank. So we can see here with Great Britain's Pluto return, and then with the Pluto return, certainly the first Pluto return of the Roman Empire, these weren't terminal events. It's not like these countries ceased to be, it's that they fundamentally changed, and in particular the way that power was being used and was being wielded fundamentally changed. So the USA was born on the 4th of July 1776, and in its chart we can see that Pluto is sitting at 27 degrees 33 minutes Capricorn. So again, what I said at the beginning, that Pluto deals with issues regarding power, disintegration, and rebirth and reintegration and so on, and of course exposing shadows, things that were otherwise unconscious. Capricorn in this case, I'm gonna stamp with structure, rules, and the establishment, which I think are key. Stephen Forrest, in his book on Pluto, had the following to say about Pluto in Capricorn. He said, quote, "The great work of Pluto in Capricorn is, I suspect, the establishment of a sustainable, practical relationship between 10 billion humans and their finite ecosystem. Pluto in Capricorn offers the actual, practical creation of a postmodern world that works realistically and efficiently from the toilets right up to the space stations." So Pluto is currently in Capricorn, and it entered Capricorn in early 2008. So let's talk about what was going on in the world in 2008. You're not going to believe it. It was a wild year. There was the financial crisis, the 2008-2009 financial crisis, which really exposed and brought to light for a lot of people the mechanisms of power and wealth, and how wealth and power were intertwined, and how these levers of power were being pulled by the powers that be. That's power a lot of times, but you get my point. Bitcoin was invented. Anonymous, the hacker group Anonymous, began its campaign against Scientology. There were lots of riots in the underdeveloped world about fuel prices and food prices. Google Chrome, Android, and Spotify were all released. Since then, Pluto has remained in Capricorn. We've had the Panama Papers, we've had social media come in and be a big part of life. It's hard to imagine life without it, but it once was like that, I remember. And of course, with that, we've had all these questions of data mining and so on, and these issues of other ways for new ways for countries to perform espionage on each other, with spying and trying to influence each other, social media to influence elections and so on. It's a whole thing. You can see how all the things that I've mentioned in this list can be seen through the lens of Pluto in Capricorn. I already mentioned the financial crisis. Let's talk about Bitcoin as an example. The idea of Bitcoin is it's a solution to the problem that you have a centralized system where a certain group of people, a certain institution, whatever it is in control of the money supply and in charge of finances. So Bitcoin is the answer, where it spreads it out across lots of people. Of course, in reality, it hasn't really worked like that, because you still get whales, you still get certain individuals with power over the market and so on. But that at least was a solution presented. Social media is an example that I put in there. It's very, very interesting to consider for example, that in a lot of ways is performing the function that was previously reserved for the press, the function of disseminating information, which previously again was held in a kind of central thing. If you wanted to put a magazine or a newspaper or whatever it is, you would need access to a printing press, you'd need a staff, you'd need a building, you need all these things. But now you don't need any of that. You just need a phone or a computer, and you just go on a Facebook and you just write you write it and then you post it, and that's it. The same thing with what I'm doing. I mean, this essentially is a TV show. Podcasts are basically radio shows. So these are some of the fundamental issues and questions being raised as we are living through a Pluto and Capricorn transit. And what's interesting is that when the USA was born, of course, there was an ongoing transit of Pluto through Capricorn, and very, very similar fundamental questions were being raised at that time. The 1770s was right in the middle of the Enlightenment, also known as the Age of Reason. This was a time of empirical evidence, progressive philosophy, progressive politics, and the idea and the ideal of constitutional government. In the case of the USA in particular, the USA, you could say, represents a critique of the British Empire's abuse of power and its treatment of its colonial possessions, and of course its iron grip on the world's economy. In my understanding of societal progression and how things have moved forward is that human beings, human society, civilization starts off with a fairly egalitarian hunter-gatherer society where everyone needs to work. There is not a surplus of food that is able to support someone who doesn't work, i.e. a specialist, and so everyone pitches in. Then agriculture is developed, and with agriculture of course comes settlement, because if you start to plant crops, it means that you're going to be staying in the one place. And then over time, techniques and technology develops, you end up with a surplus of food, you can support a higher population and so on, and things continue to develop until you get some kind of hierarchical structure starts to emerge with a chief or a king even, and that blossoms into feudalism. And as that continues to grow, essentially the rich get richer and the poor kind of stay poor. So things are like this. But then over time, a middle class does start to emerge, a business class. And it's this business class which really drove the revolutions that include the American Revolution. They wanted a greater opportunity for social mobility because there was really a cap. You couldn't join the aristocracy just by being rich. They wanted the opportunity to move upwards and not just be rich in the middle class. They also wanted an opportunity to enjoy some of the privilege that was seen at that time only in the aristocracy. Of course, they also wanted access to the levers of power. They wanted more influence in decision making that was being done by the ruling class. There was a wave of revolutions that happened in the 1770s during, of course, Pluto and Capricorn, which established capitalism. And out of this, you can really say that the USA was the great experiment, because this was a real break in traditions and how things had happened, because it was the first time that a country had really been established by people who had Enlightenment thought, who really figured that if they just thought it exactly right, they could make a perfect rational utopia. And that's what they tried to do with the USA. And of course then Pluto and Capricorn, as part of the natal chart of the USA, has really left its thumbprint on the national identity of that country. And now in the 2020s, we're in an interesting situation where the country that was begun with the idea of ending empire as an opposition, an experiment of beginning a country without an aristocracy, without a ruling class, without a royal family. We're in a situation where that country has now become the empire. For example, the USA has 700 military bases overseas. 61% of international foreign currency reserves are held in US dollars. Culturally also, if you look down below in the description, I've got a link to the list of the highest grossing films worldwide. Try and find one that isn't from an American studio. I looked and I gave up looking because nearly all of them are American. Our American media gets shown everywhere, gets shipped out everywhere. The cultural influence of the United States is huge worldwide. If you look at also there's a list of the best-selling music artists as well. A high amount, not all of them, because you've got the Beatles and Shakira and whoever else, but a really large number of them are Americans as well. So now just like with the Roman Empire in its day and the British Empire in its day, the United States really is the top dog in world affairs. And now the same questions that were being asked of the Roman Empire and being asked of the British Empire during their Pluto returns, those same questions are now being asked of the United States. So now the great expose of the dirty laundry and skeletons in the closet is now happening to the United States. And weaknesses in the foundational assumptions of that country are now being exposed. I've got a quote here from astrologer Samuel F Reynolds, who said, quote, "It may be that America is dealing with its fundamental issues in economic and political disparities, and if America is not willing to face it, then America has to decide if it still wants to exist as the United States of America." And this is really it. This is what a Pluto return really brings you, especially if you are a country that is essentially a global hegemon. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. Things that are happening worldwide, there's been questions over the last decade or so, the last couple of decades, about the position of the US dollar. If countries are going to stop using that as their reserve currency, if they're going to start using euros or pounds or, I don't know, cryptocurrency, bringing up issues of regulation versus decentralization, what people really want, what's really for the betterment of humanity. Social media, as I mentioned, has been eroding the control of the establishment, for better or for worse. Another thing is discussion around the healthcare system in the USA, how you can get better healthcare to more people, which also brings in another discussion which is happening about the distribution of wealth. across the people of the USA. There's other discussions about the role of the military in the world and in American society. These are all things you'd expect to see during a Pluto return, in particular, and especially one that's happening in Capricorn. So if you want an exact date, the exact date that I've got for you is the 20th of February 2022 is the exact conjunction of Pluto conjunct Pluto, which is wild to even say because, as I say, you don't get Pluto conjunct Pluto with people. But as I said, this is more of a process than it is an event. 2023 will be the end of the conjunction. So if we say that the Pluto return is like taking a test and then getting the results of that test, 2023 is when we'll start to see the regeneration, I think, after the destruction. And just to close off this discussion, I see a lot of people referring to Pluto return as like a country killer because it is such a fundamental shakeup. But as with my historical examples, it's not necessarily that the United States is about to come to an end as a result of the Pluto return. But as Samuel F Reynolds brings up, the big question is that does the USA want to continue to exist as the USA? It's like you can't go back. There's no way back. You've got to go forward, and you've got to decide. The USA collectively, and the people that make up the USA, and the people that are the USA, have got to decide what the USA is going to be going forward. Because as it was born, bringing up these fundamental questions about the ills and the evils of feudalism. It now, I don't think anyone would disagree, the USA has contributed greatly. I'm not pointing a singular finger. The USA has contributed greatly to a global system which really has a lot of evils and ills of its own. And as a planet, we have to decide what we're going to do. But certainly the country which is top dog in the global system probably has a bigger say than the rest of us. So think wisely, please. All right, that's that. Those are my thoughts on the Pluto return of the USA. This has been a bit of a pilot video, so let me know what I did well. Let me know what you think I could do differently, and thanks for watching. Cheers.